guys, it's Geekonomics here, and today I am bringing a feedback video for my Year 11 students with regard to the A592 paper which we did just before the half-term break. And you'll remember that we were tackling question 2 on the June 2012 paper. Indeed, at the end of that lesson, you may recall I said we might put a halt to doing these past papers because progress has been so good. However, this particular paper, a lot of you struggle with it, and so number one, I'm really glad we did it because obviously we can go back and iron out a few misunderstandings, but it also occurs to me that really we ought to press on and keep doing these past papers. I know that you'll be delighted. So let's take a look at the questions and let's see where we struggled on this particular question paper. So first question, 2-part A, simply asked you to read some numbers off the exam paper, not very taxing at all. Everybody getting 2 out of 2. Question 2B then was referring to the rate of interest paid on savings accounts. And you were presented with 3 different accounts. If memory serves me, one of them was an e-saver, an internet-based account. One of them was an ISA, and one of them was some type of fixed 2-year bond, I think it was. And you were then asked, what are the 2 factors which determine the amount of interest paid on these accounts? Now, a lot of you got into all sorts of different things which were really just totally irrelevant. You're talking about inflation and taxation. Really, you just needed to say 2 things. Number one, the access to the account. How easy is it to get access to my money? Can I just walk into the bank and draw out all of the money from the account? Or do I have to leave the money in the account for a certain amount of time? Banks, of course, in their vaults, do not hold everybody's deposits in the bank vault. What do they do with that money? Well, as they are privately owned, profit-seeking enterprises, when you deposit your money, they keep a small percentage of it in reserve in their bank, but the rest of it they then lend, and they make loans and issue mortgages and so on and so forth in order to make money with using your money. So they don't have all of the money in at one time. Therefore, that is the reason why if you wish to draw out a large sum of money at any one time, most often you will have to phone the bank and say, look, I'm coming in, I wish to withdraw £2,000-3,000, can you have it ready for me in 2 or 3 days? And if you give them advance notice, they will do that for you. So first point is, if you have immediate access to all of your money all of the time, then the interest rate that you will receive on that will be very low. And then the second point is, some of these accounts which are referenced in the exam paper require you to deposit a very substantial initial deposit. So if the initial deposit is higher, then the rate of interest that you will earn on it is also higher. Whereas, for example, the e-saver, which you're quoted in the exam paper, the e-saver account, you can open that with a minimum balance of £1. Well, that's fine, but the rate of interest on it will be minimal. So bear that in mind, please. A lot of you are reading too much into these questions, I think, and trying to find and make it more complicated than it really is. Right, question 2C. The question goes along the lines of, explain how the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England would use the base rate in order to reduce the rate of inflation. Now, there were some tremendous answers on this, and most of the tremendous answers featured a diagram. But let's just consider what the Bank of England should do. What would be the appropriate case of action? Well, the appropriate case of action, ladies and gentlemen, would be to increase the base rate. And if you recall your aggregate demand equation, consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports, if you in your answer went through and explained the impact of an increase in the base rate on each of these, that would be a really tremendous answer. So, for example, if you increase the base rate, what is likely to happen to consumption? Well, when you increase the base rate, the opportunity cost of spending goes up. And therefore, you'll find it's more attractive for people to put their money into the bank and save it. Obviously, if they're saving it, they're not spending it. So consumption ought, theoretically, to fall. What about investment? Well, remind ourselves, what is investment? The I component here is investment by firms on capital goods, machinery. Very expensive machinery. How do these firms afford such machinery? They take on a loan. Well, if the base rate of interest goes up, more than likely loan repayments and interest rates on loans will go up. Therefore, firms are less likely to take on the investment. So investment will fall. G, as you know, is government spending, which is set out in government policy, and governments tend to stick to that regardless of interest rates, so we can ignore that one. What about net exports? Remember, the price of an export always moves in the same direction as the currency. I'll say that again. The price of an export always moves in the same direction as the base rate. Just as well I said it again because I said it wrong the first time. The price of an export always moves in the same direction as the base rate. So if the base rate goes up, the price of an export goes up. And ceteris paribus, the demand for the export should fall. So, falling. Tremendous diagram, which I was delighted to see so many of you using, was this one, where we have the AD curve. Obviously it is shifting to the left. If this is falling, this is falling, this is falling, then AD is falling. So we're shifting it in this direction. Remember to put your direction of travel. So we have the level of real output. Still a lot of you using Q here instead of Y. You've got to be very careful on that. It's Y for a macro diagram, Q for micro. And the price level falling. So that would be a tremendous answer. If you really wanted to be fancy-dancy about this, what you could also say is this. AS1, AD1, price level, and the level of national income here. So if you really want to be a fancy Dan about this is obviously talking about demand pull inflation and reducing the effects of it. If you really want to be fancy about it, you could also talk about what would happen to cost push inflation. Now, cost push inflation would of course impact AS rather than AD. When the base rate rises, we said that the price of the export goes up, demand for the export falls. But what about import prices, raw material prices, costs for firms? Well, the import prices become cheaper because, of course, imports are the flip side of the export coin. And so you could therefore say that costs of production for some firms might fall, and so AS would shift to the right. And again, we can show that that would also lead to a reduction in the price level, moving in this direction this time. So we're covering demand pull and cost push. I mean, that really is well above and beyond the call of duty in this respect, but that really would be a tremendous answer. Most of you tended to focus on this one, and I would encourage you to do that. But the fancy Dans amongst you might want to focus here. Okay, so that's 2C. And finally, question 2D. Discuss the extent to which inflation is harmful to the UK economy. Now, this has really cost so many of you so many marks. Very disappointing set of answers on this one. We really, and you really, must go over Unit 4.6, which goes through all the costs and benefits of inflation. You really must do that. I'm really glad that we've done this paper because it's highlighted a key area which we must revise in the run up to the 2016 June exams. So let's go through this one. So inflation, I would obviously expect to see a definition of inflation at the start. Inflation is a sustained rise in the price level measured in percentage terms. You may wish to quote the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is 0.2% at the moment in the UK, and the Retail Price Index, which is 1.2% at the moment in the UK. Now, there are a number of costs, a number of benefits, and then you want to sort of bring it all together at the end of this discussion. So let's go through each of the costs in turn. First one is shoe leather costs. So the implication here is that when prices are rising, if you're a shopper and you're not shopping online, you're shopping in the high street, then you spend a lot more of your time wandering from shop to shop to find the cheapest product. And in effect, you wear out your shoe leather. I'm sorry I don't have my square shoes on to show you today, ladies and gentlemen, but you wear out your shoe leather. So that's that one. Easy as that. Second one, menu costs. If you run a cafe, a restaurant, or if you thinking back 20 years ago when everything was priced via a pricing gun, none of this online business and all these electronic pricing systems, if inflation is changing all the time, you obviously have to change your prices all the time. You have to update your menus, your catalogues and so on. And there's a cost implication there. Now, that has been negated quite a lot nowadays because so much is done online, and therefore you can do it at the touch of a button. But there will still be some type of administrative cost to that. Thirdly, how does inflation redistribute incomes? Well, if you are a saver, and let's say you're getting 2% on your savings, well, obviously if inflation is running at 5%, you will be getting worse off day after day after day. So think of pensioners nowadays. What do pensioners live off? They live off their savings. Why are pensioners unhappy at the moment? They're unhappy because of the very low rates of interest that they earn on their savings. I guess the only thing, they're quite lucky at the moment in respect that inflation, RPI anyway, is only 1.2%. But were it 5%, then obviously they would be much worse off. So savers lose out during times of inflation. The wage price spiral, classical economics here. Wages go up, so what would trade unions push for from employers? They would push for higher wages. How would employers cover the cost of that? They put prices up. Prices go up, then workers ask for further rounds of wage increases, and so the cycle continues. And so you get this wage price spiral. Fifthly, there's a competitiveness issue here. If domestic prices are rising faster than our competitors' prices in the European Union, for example, then of course we become less competitive, and the demand for our goods, if it was all solely dependent on price, the demand for our goods would fall. That would obviously lead us into trade deficit problems where the value of imports start to become greater than the value of exports, or certainly start to move in that direction. Inflation obviously causes uncertainty in an economy, there's a lack of investment, and it can lead to unemployment, particularly if inflation starts to really get out of hand. You'll know there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment from your studies of the Phillips curve. And then lastly, which some of you did mention, if things get really out of hand, such as in the sort of 1930s, you can start to generate this hyperinflation. So those are all, and they're not all of the costs, but there's a good number of them. What about the benefits? Are there any benefits to inflation? My, there are. Good golly, Miss Molly, there are. asset prices. It won't be your generation, it's not my generation, it's probably my parents' generation. So people who bought houses, and when we're talking about assets, that's really what we're talking about in this instance, people who bought houses in the 1980s have experienced probably house price inflation in the hundreds of percents. So I get, if you were buying a house in 1987, you could probably have bought a house for about £3,000 in 1987. So now you fast forward, 97, 2007, we're almost 30 years down the line, that same house is probably going to sell and have some type of market value, probably about 300,000. So people, and probably your grandparents, that's what we're talking about, they have benefited tremendously from house price inflation. And this is why some people would say, well, why are pensioners complaining about the income distribution effects, so the impacts on their savings, when they've never had it so good in terms of asset price inflation. So if you bought a house back then, you quids in. Also, inflation can be a sign of a growing economy. You'll know from your studies of macro that as we move around, and as AD moves around the AS curve, so here's AD1 moving to AD2, moving to AD3, so we can see here that the economy is growing, Y1 round to YF, but as it does so, there's a trade-off here in this section here, in this curve section, which I've referred to over here when we were talking about the Phillips curve. So you're getting more inflation, but on the plus side, you're getting more growth as well. So it's an indicator, if it's demand pull inflation at least, it's an indicator of a growing economy. And then finally, we said that savers, it's costly to savers, but to borrowers, inflation is a good thing. And I refer you again to our example here with regard to houses and house prices. So, let's not use such an extreme example, but let's say you bought a house 30 years ago for £100 and you took on a 100% mortgage. So in other words, you borrowed all of the £100. You might have taken that on what might be referred to as an interest-only mortgage. In other words, you're not paying off any of the £100, you're just paying the interest that's accumulating on it all the time. Fast forward, let's say a number of years, and now that house, let's say it's worth £1,000. Well, your mortgage does not go up simply because the price of the house goes up. Your mortgage will still be £100. So, in relative terms, that debt is easier for you to manage, and the debt burden, the proportion, and in relative terms, the relative size of that debt is falling all the time, because here you had 100% mortgage because you were borrowing all of the money against the £100 house. Now £100 over here, well, that's only 10%. £100 is only a 10% of 1,000. So your mortgage is then only 10% of the asset price. So in that respect, for you as the borrower, inflation's a good thing. And this is why, just as a little aside, this is why some political commentators would argue that the UK government deliberately tries to stoke inflation because it makes the relative value of their debt burden appear less. But that's another issue. So let's tie all this together. Let's talk about the UK. So the UK has a target for inflation of 2. And it can be plus or minus 1% either side. So it can be 3% within target, 1% within target. It's what's known as a symmetrical target. Why not have a target of 0%? Well, 0% doesn't give you much flex, doesn't give you much room to manoeuvre as an economy and as a monetary policy committee and for the Bank of England. So hence it's not 0%. It allows for the economy to have you know, what we've seen here, which is have some growth but also build into that some inflation as well. It's also not too close to zero, and of course once you get to that territory you're in danger of tipping into deflation, such as the Japanese experience for the last 30 years, which is almost more dangerous than inflation. So it avoids that. Is inflation harmful? You would have to say, on balance, there are certainly a lot of costs to it. However, if it is stable, so in other words, if it's not shooting up and down all the time, so if it's, you know, 1% one month, 1 and a bit the next month, this provides, particularly firms and businesses, this provides them with the confidence and the certainty that they require in order to make investments. And if investment goes into the economy, as you know from AD and AS, AD shifts out, AS shifts out. So these are both good things for a healthy, growing and sustainably growing economy. So an awful lot to include in your answer there, ladies and gentlemen, to Part D. And we're really going to have another look at this again when you return after you've had a lovely half-term holiday. So see you then.